Your parents aren't evil. They're just the product of the greatest economic anomaly in human history, mixed with a lifetime of unchecked cognitive dissonance and an absolute, fundamental refusal to transition from the hero of the story to the elder. Every Thanksgiving, millions of you sit across the table from a generation that bought a 4-bedroom house on a shoe salesman's salary back in 1974, and they look you dead in the eye and tell you that you can't afford a mortgage because you buy iced coffee. You get angry, you argue, you try and show them the inflation data. Stop. You're arguing with a brick wall built in an alternate reality. Today on Sober Psychology, we're putting the baby boomer generation on blast. We're not here to whine and we're not here to play the victim. We're going to look at the clinical data. We're going to discuss Christopher Lasch's research on the culture of narcissism, the terrifying neurobiology of the lead crime hypothesis, and the biblical tragedy of a generation that traded the sacred crown of elderhood for a freaking golf cart and an RV. If you're tired of feeling crazy every time you talk to your parents, you need to understand the machinery of their mindset. I'm Michael. I'm a psychologist in training, a proud millennial, a sober dad, and today we're breaking the generational curse. So let's get to work. Welcome to the show where we break down the mental health stigma, navigate sobriety with humor, and prove that it's okay to laugh while you heal. Let's get real, let's get honest, and maybe a little weird. Growth is messy, but you don't have to do it alone. This is Sober Psychology. If you're a millennial or a Gen Z, you're living in a psychological pressure cooker. Out here in Midland, you see this all the time. You got guys that are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week trying to raise their kids, trying to stay sober, trying to keep their marriage intact while the cost of living is actively suffocating them. And then you pick up the phone to talk to your boomer parents, hoping for a little bit of empathy, maybe even a little bit of wisdom. And what do you get? Well, back in my day, we just pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. Or the idea that it's simplistic enough to just say, have you gone in and tried to shake your manager's hand? It makes you want to rip your hair out. But here's the psychological truth that you have to accept. They literally cannot understand you. In psychology, we talk about the locus of control. If you have an internal locus of control, you believe that your actions dictate your success. If you have an external locus of control, you believe that the environment dictates your success. The boomer generation grew up in a post-World War II economic boom that will never be replicated. They could fall backward into a middle-class lifestyle. And because that environment was so favorable, they developed a massive delusion. They mistook a booming macroeconomic environment for their own personal work ethic. They think they hit a triple, but they were born on third base. So when you strike out against a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, they don't see a systemic failure. They see a character flaw in you. Their lack of empathy isn't always malicious. It's a profound inability to comprehend an environment they've never lived in. So we know there's an empathy gap, but how do they actually justify it in their own heads? How do they look at a housing market where the average home is 10 times the average salary and still tell you to just work harder? They're suffering from a cognitive bias called the just world fallacy. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Melvin Lerner discovered that the human brain has a desperate need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair. We want to believe that good things happen to good people and that bad things happen to bad people. If a boomer admits that modern economy is structurally broken, they have to confront a terrifying psychological reality. They have to admit that their own success was not 100% the result of their own hard work. They have to admit that they had a tailwind. They have to admit that buying a house for $35,000 in 1978 on a single income wasn't because they were geniuses. It was because they hit the macroeconomic lottery. To protect their ego from that realization, they deploy something called the just world fallacy. If they succeeded, it's because they were incredibly hard workers. If you are failing, it's gotta be because you're lazy. You eat too much avocado toast or you buy too much iced coffee. They're mathematically gaslighting you to protect their own origin story. When they give you financial advice from 1985, they're not actually trying to help you. They're subconsciously defending the narrative of their own greatness. I really didn't want to put this section in there because when writing this script, I was emotionally charged, but I wanted to be fair. I wanted to have an unbiased approach to this. If we're going to be brutally honest, we have to talk about biology. We have to talk about why an entire generation seems to struggle so deeply with emotional regulation, impulse control, and empathy. And in order to do that, I think it's fair that we look at the lead crime hypothesis and environmental neurobiology. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the environment was absolutely saturated with tetraethyl lead. Tetraethyl lead can be found in leaded gasoline, lead paint, lead in water pipes. The baby boomer generation was exposed to catastrophic levels of a known neurotoxin during their most critical years of brain development. Again, it hurts me very much to even bring this up because it almost sounds like I'm making an excuse for that generation, but this is a reality that someone has to pay attention to. So you may be asking yourself, what does lead do to the human brain? Great question. There are studies published in the Journal of American Medical Association, which is the JAMA, which show that childhood lead exposure literally shrinks the prefrontal cortex, which if you've paid any attention to psychology or neurobiology or this channel, you know that that is the part of the brain that is responsible for what? Impulse control, emotional regulation, and complex empathy. It also hypertrophies, which is just a fancy way of saying enlarge or overgrowth, the amygdala, which is the brain's fear and aggression center. When you're sitting at dinner and your boomer father throws a full-blown toddler tantrum because the waiter got his order wrong, or your mother completely lacks the cognitive flexibility to understand your perspective, you're often watching neurological impairment in real time. And like I said at the beginning, the hardest part of this is the reframed perspective because this removes the accusation. They aren't choosing to be stubborn. Many of them are operating with compromised hardware. You can't demand high-level emotional intelligence from a brain that was marinated in heavy metals. So you have an economic anomaly combined with compromised neurobiology. So what does that produce culturally? It produced something that social critic Christopher Lasch documented in his book written in 1979 called The Culture of Narcissism. Tom Wolfe called them the me generation. In the 1970s, the boomers shifted the cultural focus from community and duty to absolute, unadulterated self-actualization. They popularized the idea that your highest moral duty was to find yourself and to be happy, regardless of the collateral damage to your family and your children. So how did this affect us, their kids? The boomers were the first generation to weaponize the divorce courts en masse in the pursuit of the personal happiness. They gave birth to a generation of the latchkey kids, which are the kids who returned to an empty home after school, or they were left unsupervised for significant periods of time while the parents worked. How many of you spent more time being raised by your grandparents or your friends' parents or a housekeeper or a babysitter than you did your actual parents? This is the group of Gen X and the older millennials that we see a lot of the latchkey kids showing up in. From an attachment theory perspective, when a parent prioritizes their own self-discovery over the stability of their own home, the child develops an anxious or avoidant attachment style. An anxious attachment style is the fear of abandonment, which results in high intimacy and this constant need for reassurance. Or you've got the avoidant attachment style, which is the fear of losing their independence, which that ultimately leads to emotional detachment and a need for space. You grew up realizing that your parents' comfort was more important than your security. This is why our generation is obsessed with therapy and reparenting. We're trying to clean up the psychological shrapnel left behind by a generation that prioritizes self-esteem over self-sacrifice. But here's the devastating irony of the me generation. Their obsession with self-actualization didn't make them happy. It made them incredibly, profoundly isolated. Right now, the boomer generation is experiencing an unprecedented epidemic of loneliness, and they don't understand why. So maybe we can help them out a little bit. In order to do that, we're going to look at the psychology of hyper-individualism. The boomer version of the American dream was built on separation. Move out of the city, buy a single-family home in the suburbs, build a massive wooden fence, don't rely on your neighbors, don't live with your parents. Independence was the ultimate idol. For thousands of years, human beings lived in interdependent, multi-generational villages. You needed your family to survive. The boomers dismantled the village and replaced it with the pursuit of individual wealth. But guess what, boomers? You can't hug a 401k. Now they're in their 70s, they have their 4,000 square foot house, they have a massive fence, and they're sitting inside staring at a television screen, wondering why their kids only visit twice a year out of obligation. They traded interdependence for independence, and that bill has come due. They built fortresses, but they forgot that a fortress is just a prison that you lock from the inside. So they're sitting in their fortress, completely isolated, and then something terrifying happens. They hit 65, they retire. You'd think this is the finish line. They have the pension, they have the 401k, the paid off house. They should be thrilled, but instead you watch them spiral into anxiety, depression, and the absolute obsession with micromanaging your life. Why is that? In psychology, there's a concept called identity foreclosure. It happens when a person commits to an identity without ever exploring who they actually are. The boomer generation worshipped at the altar of hypercapitalism. They were told that their entire worth as a human being was tied to their job title, their income, and their productivity. They didn't cultivate hobbies. They didn't cultivate deep, vulnerable friendships. They cultivated resumes. When they hand in their retirement paperwork, they aren't just losing a paycheck, they're losing their entire psychological scaffolding. They wake up on a Tuesday morning and the world doesn't need them. Their phone isn't ringing. There are no emails to answer. They're staring into the identity void. And because they never learned how to just be, they have to manufacture a sense of control and importance. So they turn that aggression, that corporate management energy onto you. They start treating your marriage and your parenting like a middle management project that they need to oversee. Their unsolicited advice about how you raise your kids isn't actually about your kids. It's a desperate, frantic attempt to feel relevant in a world that has moved on without them. This brings us to the spiritual tragedy of this generation. In every healthy civilization in human history, there's a clear transition of power. You spend your youth as the warrior. You spend your middle age as the king or the builder. And in your old age, you step down from the throne and you become the elder. The elder's job isn't to consume. The elder's job is to pass down wisdom, to bless the next generation, and to prepare for death with dignity. But a narcissistic culture is terrified of death, and it's terrified of irrelevance. Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." We have an entire generation that has inverted this verse. They're spending their children's inheritance to fund their own perpetual adolescence. They're hoarding the wealth, refusing to retire from leadership positions, and demanding that their kids applaud them for it. They traded the sacred biblical crown of the elder for a timeshare in Florida and an RV. Instead of being the wise counselors in the gates of the city, they're watching cable news 12 hours a day, addicted to the outrage, fighting phantom wars on Facebook, and wondering why their kids don't call them. They're spiritually bankrupt because you can't be a consumer and an elder at the same time. And this brings us to the ultimate battleground between you and your parents: boundaries. Have you ever noticed how angry a boomer gets when you use therapy language? When you say, "I'm setting a boundary," or "I need to protect my peace," their amygdala completely hijacks their brain. They mock therapy, they call our generation weak. And why? Because in their psychological framework, compliance equals love. In psychology, we talk about enmeshment. An enmeshed family system has no emotional boundaries. If mom is angry, everyone has to be anxious. If dad is stressed, everyone has to be quiet. To an enmeshed parent, you're not an independent human being. You're an extension of their ego. You're a prop in their movie. So when you go to therapy and you learn how to individuate, is that even a word? When you finally say, "No, I'm not coming to Thanksgiving this year because that environment's really toxic," they don't hear a healthy adult making a choice. They hear a rejection of their entire existence because they never learned emotional regulation. Your boundary feels like a physical attack. They mock therapy because therapy is dismantling the control mechanisms they've relied on for 40 years. Do not apologize for going to therapy. Do not apologize for breaking the enmeshment. Your peace is more important than their preference for compliance. If there's one phrase that defines the boomer generation, it's this: back in my day, things were simpler. Back in my day, people respected each other. The country is falling apart. I hope no boomer in your life sounds like that, but just in case, maybe you can associate. From a neurological standpoint, this is a cognitive bias called ROSY retrospection. The human brain tends to remember the past more positively than it actually experienced it. They're remembering the 70s and 80s through a filter of youth, high dopamine, and high neuroplasticity. They aren't actually nostalgic for the economy of 1982. They're nostalgic for their 25-year-old knees and their 25-year-old optimism. But when nostalgia becomes an obsession, it turns into a spiritual sickness. One of my favorite books in the Bible, Ecclesiastes, talks about this. Ecclesiastes 7:10 is a verse every boomer needs framed in their living room. It says, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." The Bible views an obsession with the past as a form of foolishness. Why? It's because you can't build the kingdom of God by looking in the rearview mirror. Think about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God is leading Lot and his family out of the destruction into a new future. He gives them one command: do not look back. And what does Lot's wife do? She looks back. She's so attached to the past, so desperate for the way that things used to be, that she turns into a pillar of salt. Nostalgia paralyzes you. When a generation is obsessed with how great things used to be, they turn into pillars of salt. They become rigid, bitter, and completely useless for the challenges of today. You can't ask a pillar of salt for directions to the promised land. Stop arguing with them about what year the world peaked. Let them live in 1985 in their minds. You have a family to lead in 2026. We're going to land the plane here. You can't change them. You can't show them a spreadsheet that'll make them understand the economy. You can't argue them into having empathy. If you keep trying to extract water from a dry well, you're the one choosing to die of thirst. So what do? As a sober dad, my job is to make sure that the buck stops with me. I look at my son and I promise him that he will not have to parent me when I'm 65. We talked about this last week. We've talked about it a couple of other times on the show. One of the best ways to deal with narcissists, especially a narcissistic generation, is the tactical execution of the gray rock method. When you interact with them, deploy the gray rock method. Be polite, be respectful, but be emotionally uninteresting. When they say, "Nobody wants to work anymore," you say, "Interesting perspective," and you change the subject. Don't take the bait. Don't try and win the argument. You're dealing with people who have outsourced their reality to cable news. Stop expecting them to be the elders they refuse to become. You're the adult now. Grieve the parents you wish you had, accept the parents you actually have, and put all your energy into making sure you don't repeat the cycle. Leave an inheritance. Build your peace. Don't let their cognitive dissonance hijack your nervous system. I'm Michael. This is Sober Psychology. If you got value out of this, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Go to the comments and let me know the wildest boomer advice you've ever been given that completely ignores modern reality. Let's laugh about it, let it go, and get back to work. Keep your head up, keep your heart open, and go help somebody. Love you guys.